I'm pleased to be welcoming our two outstanding panelists for today's talk, The Widening War. If I can start with Professor Joseph Massad. He is a Palestinian academic who teaches modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University. His work has focused on Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli nationalism, and his book, Islam in Liberalism, was also the title of his keynote address delivered yesterday at the inauguration. Ahmed Rashid needs no introduction on an LLF stage, but let me add, for the sake of this session, that his book, Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil and Fundamentalism in Central Asia, was a New York Times bestseller for 5 weeks, translated in 22 languages, and was used extensively by American analysts in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. Joseph, if I may start with you, the conflict has been called Israel's 9/11 moment, and for thousands of displaced Gazans, their second Nakba. How do you perceive the two in the light of Israeli and Palestinian nationalistic narratives?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. First of all, of course, I will contest the use of the term conflict. The term conflict, in fact, is not a neutral term, but a Zionist term to transform the nature of the struggle of the Palestinians, which is a national liberation struggle against the colonial settler regime. We've never heard of an Algerian-French conflict when France was the settler colonizer of Algeria. We've never heard even of a black and white conflict in South Africa, which was a struggle against white supremacy. So the choice of the term conflict in the Palestinian case is in fact an endorsement of a Zionist vocabulary, which unfortunately even people in the Arab world have internalized as a result of the hegemony of the use of Zionist terms in the Western media, as well as sort of more generally, increasingly even in the Arab media and elsewhere. So, I mean, the idea of 9/11 is, of course, an absurd situation. After all, the claim that Israel was attacked from the outside is the biggest lie. These are an occupied and colonized people under Israeli jurisdiction. So the claim that Israel should have the right to defend itself would only work if it was attacked by a foreign country, not by the colonized population who are trying to break out of a concentration camp where they had been placed for the last 17 years and being occupied and colonized since 1967. Of course, international law grants the Palestinians the right to resist their colonizer and occupier, including the use of armed resistance, which is a time-honored and legal method of resisting a foreign occupation. Therefore, this was an uprising. This was a prison break against the Israeli occupation, and to pretend that it is terrorism, as the Israelis try to dub it, or even to pretend it's a situation of 9/11 is absolutely inapt, of course. For the Palestinians, it is a second catastrophe, or maybe many catastrophes. The Nakba didn't end in 1948. In fact, it started back in the 1880s when Zionist Jewish colonial settlers began to displace Palestinians from their lands. And initially it was a legal displacement, and subsequently it became an outright ethnic cleansing in 1948, during which about 13,000 people, Palestinians, were killed, 11,000 of whom were civilians, plus about 4,000 Arab soldiers and volunteers who are part of that war. Since then, of course, the Israelis have invaded various Arab countries. In 1956, they, along with Britain and France, in a conspiracy kind of invasion that they launched against Egypt. In 1967, Israel also invaded Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In 1978, and again in 1982, it invaded Lebanon. In 1981, it bombed Iraq. Subsequently, it bombed Tunisia and Sudan. There's no country in the Middle East that has not suffered from the violence that this European settler colony has inflicted on the Middle East, more largely, but specifically on the Arab world and on the Palestinians. In the ongoing genocidal war, of course, as we now know, there are 100,000 people that have been injured or killed, 30,000 killed, more than 70,000 injured. We don't know the number in the thousands of people who are still buried under the rubble. And the entire population of more than 2 million people have been displaced. So it is a second Nakba in a certain way. But at the moment, remember the Nakba in 1948 meant also the expulsion of 90% of the Palestinian people within the area that the Zionists conquered and came to occupy. At the moment, there's basically 100% of the Gaza population, but not of the entire Palestinian people who have been displaced so far within Gaza. And who knows what the next few weeks will, end up, what's going to end up happening as a result. Yeah.
Ahmed, 50 years ago, the blow to Israeli security by Hamas would have required the combined forces of the Arab world. In fact, the October 7th attacks took place on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. If there is one takeaway from this uprising, it is the participation of non-state actors in an armed conflict. You have, of course, brilliantly charted the rise of the Taliban in the Afghan conflict. How do you see this David versus Goliath showdown impacting this phenomenon of non-state actors?
Well, I think that there are two.
Yeah.
I think there are two, very important factors which have changed the landscape of this uprising struggle in the Middle East. The first is that what we're talking about is our political arguments which the Palestinians have put forward over the years and which have been steadily ignored by Israel, by America, and by other big powers. But the fact is that the political demands of for land, for justice, for peace, the political demands of the Palestinians have developed in a very positive way. And this is something that Israel has not been able to recognize. It's not been able to deal with Palestinians who actually articulate political demands and not just are fighting a war or a guerrilla war. And the other stage, yes, is the development of non-state actors, Hamas in particular, but other groups as well, who've gone about preparing themselves for a war with incredible dexterity in the way they have, built these tunnels and done all the logistics needed for an uprising. And the other struggle, which has been very important, has been the West Bank, where the Palestinians have waged a consistently deadening attacks, and they have been dealt with very harshly by the Israelis. So now what we are faced with is a very complicated, complex game plan, both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. It's not a simple black and white operation. And now for the first time, you have the enlistment of countries in the south, Brazil, South Africa, quite prominent countries are demanding, Algeria, demanding an end to this war. Where the failure has been, I think, should be pointed out that the Arab states largely have allowed the Palestinians to be slaughtered by the Israelis. And the Arab states have not come to the help as they did in the Yom Kippur War and other conflicts in Lebanon and other places. There was a time, if you remember, when King Faisal imposed an oil embargo on the West. We have not seen any action taken like that in this conflict, even though far more people have died and been dealt with. And thirdly, I think the other really important factor is what is going on in Israel itself, and that is that Prime Minister Netanyahu is probably the most unpopular prime minister that the Israelis have had. And there have been, remember, before this insurgency, there was weeks and weeks of demonstrations by Israelis against the change of laws that he was imposing. Now, this is not something that we saw in the 60s or the 70s. This is something very radical and very new. And I think the Israelis are at a complete loss as to how to deal with because the last thing they expected was the Palestinians to project political arguments as well as fighting a war. And that has come as a big shock to them, I think.
So if I can just take it from here, Joseph, it was thought that the US might prevail upon Israel to hand over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority and to govern in place of Hamas. But just like Ahmed was saying a few days ago, the Israeli Knesset rejected Palestinian statehood unilaterally, and they did so without even looking at the possibility of it being put under the sort of governing of the Palestinian Authority. And just yesterday, in fact, the Israeli Prime Minister laid out his plan for Gaza, run by local leaders, which he hasn't specified who or what organization they belong to. So how does this impact the Palestinian Authority's role within Palestinian nationalism as such?
Before I answer this question, I'd like to quibble a bit with the discussion. Again, I will quibble with the name of the 1973 October War. The Yom Kippur War is an Israeli Zionist nomenclature, not a Palestinian or Arab one. It's called the October War, or the Ramadan War, in fact, and not the Yom Kippur War. And at that time, the Arab governments were not helping the Palestinians because that was a war, in fact, between Syria and Egypt and Israel, where Syria and Egypt invaded their own Israeli-occupied territories to retrieve them. They went into the Sinai and the Golan Heights to retrieve territories that had been occupied by Israel since '67. Israel, usually in its propaganda, which is quite cheap and incredible, claims that they had attacked Israel. They never attacked Israel. The attack was on Israeli-occupied territory to retrieve it, and it was not at the behest of the Palestinians. Also, clearly Netanyahu is sufficiently popular to be elected and re-elected, so he has a huge amount of support amongst the electorate, although there is also opposition. But the Israeli Jewish opposition to Netanyahu certainly is not at the behest of the Palestinians. Both the secular, who claim to be left-wing, and they're only left-wing in Israel, they would not register as left-wing on any other political spectrum, and the right-wing religious and nationalist supporters of Netanyahu may not agree on most things, but they do agree on what to do with the Palestinian people. The demonstrations for the last year have not been about the colonial policies that Israel has followed and continues to pursue vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but rather about the rights of Jewish citizens of Israel. This is an apartheid state with upwards of 65 racist laws and more, which discriminates institutionally against its own Palestinian citizens. It is the last racist and supremacist settler colony in Asia or Africa. And the population, in fact, is not at all in disagreement with Netanyahu. The latest poll from Tel Aviv University told us that over 57% of Israeli Jews believe that the Israeli government and Netanyahu is not using a sufficient amount of firepower against the Palestinians. Another, about 30% believe that it's using the right amount, and only 1.8% of the Jewish public believes that it's using too much firepower. So we are not speaking only about a genocidal government, but about a genocidal political culture that is reflected in these polls by the Israeli Jewish public, who do not disagree with Netanyahu's policies toward the Palestinians. Now, with regards to your question and on what is being planned. The Palestinian Authority is just a quisling regime set up by Israel and the US back in 1993, 1994, precisely to be a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. It is no different from many of the subcontracted collaborators in the Third World or during colonialism with colonial powers. It has very, very little respect or support. The Americans have made sure to pump a lot of money to link the authority institutionally to the daily living of Palestinians, so that if the authority collapses, then the income of a large number of Palestinians will disappear, in the hope that it could force them or coerce them into supporting the role of the Palestinian Authority as a subcontractor to the Israeli occupation. So the attempt today to revive the Palestinian Authority, a discredited, quisling regime, it's not going to work. The Arab governments, of course, not only have not been supportive of the Palestinians, they had been, of course, constantly collaborators with Israel against the Palestinians. The Jordanian government may fulminate about the attack on the Palestinians while allowing the Israeli and American plan of creating a land bridge from Dubai to Israel through Jordan to bypass sort of the ongoing attempt by the Houthis in Yemen to prevent ships going to Israel from reaching Israel. The Saudis are in on this plan, as of course is the United Arab Emirates. The Egyptians could have really raised all kinds of issues with the ongoing violations of the Camp David Accord, of which Israel is accused, yet they have not. They give Israel a lot more leeway in allowing, in fact, or not allowing aid to go into Gaza from the Egyptian side, when Israel should not have a say in this, but it does so. So the support for Hamas as a Palestinian resistance group, of course, continues to be high among secular as well as religious Palestinians, among Christian as well as Muslim Palestinians. Remember, this is a situation where this uprising by the Palestinians of the concentration camp of Gaza has divided the world between the white supremacist European countries and the white supremacist USA and Canada, and the offshoots of settler colonies in Australia and New Zealand on one side, and the large majority of the non-white world in the third world. As Mr. Rashid has just said, South Africa, even Namibia, has been highly condemnatory, especially of the German government, since the Namibian people have also, have been the first victims of German genocidal policies. And yesterday also Palestinians in Germany began to sue the German government for its role in the ongoing genocide, especially as it insists on defending Israel's right to commit whatever atrocities it chooses to. So there are, of course, also ongoing conversations now and indeed legal proceedings at the International Court of Justice, not with regards to the case that South Africa had brought, but on account of the General Assembly, which had requested last year that the ICJ consider the legality of the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, right? So it's, all of these are occupied territories.
Ahmed, tell me, Iran's patient exploitation of this growing arc of conflict in the Middle East by the so-called non-state actors suddenly changed when it struck targets inside Pakistan. Was that a well-thought-out strategy to widen the war further that eventually backfired? And the Saudi, Emirati, Iranian rapprochement that has remained calm and that sub-region has remained largely peaceful, how do you see that destabilizing?
Well, let me just say that the Iran-Pakistan tension, conflict, whatever you want to call it, has been around for many years. And it is really based on the fact that Pakistan has clandestinely given sanctuary to Iranian dissidents, Baloch tribes who have been resisting the Iranian government. And at the same time, Iran has given sanctuary to Pakistani militants from Balochistan, from KP, and even from Karachi. So each country has been backing the enemy of the other country. The friend of the other country. And this has led to rising tension. This is not the first time we've seen militant acts against Iran. I think on the bigger picture, Iran is not interested in entering into a war right now with America or Israel. they have been very cautious as to the way they have dealt with this present crisis. Very unlike Iran, which normally plunges into these conflicts without much thought or with perhaps more militant kind of thinking. This time Iran has been extremely cautious. I don't think the Iran-Pakistan build-up is a cause of enormous concern. I think it was quickly ended by diplomats on both sides, and nobody, either Pakistan or Iran, wants any other major confrontation. There was, of course, a lot of tension between Iran and Pakistan also on the question of the Taliban, and and that has been problematic. But even that, I think, is being cured because the Taliban are not compromising on their attitude towards women, towards education, towards other things, which have annoyed not just the Western world, but annoyed countries like Iran and Pakistan. Iran, of course, has a highly literate society as compared to Pakistan. But the key thing, I think, here is that I hope that this conflict will abate and not be cause more damage in the region.
You were talking about the sort of response of the global South. I was reading through some of your articles, and is it true that the genocidal war against the Palestinian people is being tolerated by the West? Because, as you suggest in one of your articles, it's rallying around the last settler colony, which is Israel. And Gaza has become something of a showdown between the West and the global South, because the white settler colonies, even to this day, debate whether their colonization has been genocidal to the indigenous peoples. So do you feel that's the reason why there seems to be no end to this war?
That may not be the reason for why there isn't any end, but it is the reason for the ongoing support in the West for this war. Back in December, the United Nations General Assembly, with a vote of 153 against 10, voted for an immediate ceasefire. The 10, of course, included Israel and the US. Usually the white settler colonies all line up in support of Israel, because they understand that this is what Israel is doing and has done, is something that they have done and they continue to do. But also, of course, the colonizing countries who had set up these settler colonies have a very, very similar attitude. But generally, in addition to the vote in December, just 2 days ago, I think yesterday, there was a vote at the Security Council. Yes. Again, 13 in support, 1 abstention, and 1 veto by the US against a ceasefire. The ICJ decision that the case that South Africa brought against Israel for committing genocide, which it found plausible, was decided by 14 out of the 15 permanent judges on the court. So it gives you an idea about the division, right? And of course, I mean, genocide and war in the Western media, which dominates the world, because the white supremacist media, in fact, including the liberal Western white-dominated media, which continues to be white supremacist. I mean, you just compare, for example, the coverage of what happened in Ukraine, where the Western media was actually egging on Ukrainians to use Molotov cocktails and attack the Russian invaders. In the case of the Palestinians, they are condemned even historically for walking to the apartheid wall that Israel had set up and where it began its snipers to shoot them and kill them. That is unacceptable, right? So any attempt, and of course I want to go back to a point raised before, the Palestinians, amazingly, have been so compromising since the early 1970s. They initially offered, of course, a one-state democratic secular state with everyone being equal. As we know, for settler colonists, the possibility of equality with the natives is a fate worse than death, right? As we know, for example, the 1 million French settlers in Algeria immediately left to France when the Algerian independence was achieved and they were promised equality. So denial of racial and colonial privileges for colonial settlers is always a fate worse than death. We see this having happened in a number of the settler colonies besides Algeria, also in Tunisia to a large extent, even in places like Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, where in fact they maintained their economic racial privileges, because this was the deal where the US insisted it would not allow apartheid to end, except if economic apartheid is maintained, and the white settlers would maintain possession of their ill-gotten property. So they basically made a compromise. We will end political apartheid in exchange for economic apartheid. But you see this even today in Germany's racist policies toward the Palestinians and its claim that it's doing this to make up for its crimes against the Jewish people. Remember, Germany doesn't seem to feel the same amount of guilt about the Roma people, right? The Roma people today are pursued, repressed, treated badly across Europe, even though they're also Holocaust survivors. But they have not been whiteified after World War II. What happened by the late 1950s is that there was a movement to finally review the status of many populations, including European Jews, who then began to be considered as white by the late 50s and early 60s, which is why today the white supremacist media sees them as deserving of its sympathy. The idea was that if they had not been white, they would not care about them, right? And of course, when they were not considered white, everybody ignored them and let them die in the concentration camps. So the reason why there is sympathy today by countries that had ignored Jews and their suffering during the Holocaust and during the Nazi period is because at the time they were not in any way considered white. By the 1960s, they'd been re-evaluated as white people and therefore deserving of this. So as a result, we don't see, for example, these European countries being concerned about the Aborigines of Australia, the First Nations of Canada, Native Americans, or the Maoris in New Zealand, any more than they are for the Palestinians. So it's an attitude that is uniform toward non-white natives who are struggling for liberation.
Ahmed, the US was using its war in Afghanistan and Iraq as a cautionary tale to persuade Israel not to launch a ground offensive in Gaza at the very start. Do you really think that the sectarian strife caused in Iraq by the US, coupled with its humiliating surrender in Afghanistan, has really taught the US a lesson? I mean, is the US even able to deliver peace in the region?
You know, there was a period during the Afghan war with the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, where many people predicted a world war as a result of this. Here were the Americans and the Russians fighting a war over Afghanistan, which could lead to horrible consequences. The same kind of fears are being raised now about the conflict in the Middle East. The first thing is that, you know, the situation right now in the Middle East, of course, is much more dangerous than it was during the Afghan war. But I think again, I go back to saying what everyone has been stunned by has been for the fact that the Palestinians are a political force in the Middle East, which Israel and the Americans and other countries have not acknowledged for a very long time, in fact, ever. And what we saw in earlier times was the Israelis denigrating the Palestinians because they didn't have a political agenda. Well, now they certainly do, and it's not to create a world war situation in the Middle East. So I think what we are really now faced with the need to acknowledge the fact that the Palestinians not only are fighting, but they are also resisting more Israeli occupation, but above all, they are articulating a political program and a plan which is something that the Israelis have not been able to do. One of the frustrations the Americans have with Netanyahu is the fact that he has not put forward a plan for the future governance of Gaza and the West Bank. That has really been a big detrimental to the Israelis, because they seemed, while the Palestinians have a political agenda, which is very mature and been there for a long time, the Israelis seem to have no political agenda. And I think this Knesset vote in support of Netanyahu, I think this will blow away once elections are held in Israel, and I'm sure there will be some kind of new leadership, maybe another coalition government, maybe a very weak government. But nevertheless, I'm sure it will bring about changes, because that's what the Israeli people want.
So, Joseph, this merger of crises in the Middle East, on the one end of the spectrum you see violent skirmishes on the border between Hezbollah and Israel. On the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, you have the Houthis, and they've brought international shipping to its knees. Damascus is being bombed. Iraqi sovereignty is being challenged by US airstrikes. How do you think all of these cycles of resistance converged around this one war?
Well, I mean, first of all, Iraq has very little sovereignty because there's still American troops stationed there, in addition to the ongoing sort of control of security aspects of Iraq. Syria also is not only occupied by Israel in the Golan Heights, but also the Americans are an occupation force in eastern Syria as well, illegally, and siphoning off and stealing its oil reserves as well, and pocketing it. In addition, of course, Turkey is an occupation of some parts of northern Syria as well. So there are three occupying forces. In addition, of course, the Israelis have been bombing Syria non-stop, including its civilian airports, almost on a weekly basis for the last several years. So this is also not new. What we do have that is more recent is the engagement, of course, and the support that Hezbollah has rendered to the Palestinians. Remember, Hezbollah has been fighting Israel because of its occupation of Lebanon and for the liberation of the remaining territories that the Israelis continue to occupy and refuse to withdraw from. And in solidarity with the Palestinians. The Houthis have done, indeed, that's the biggest demonstration, in addition to Hezbollah, of pan-Arab support for the Palestinians. And of course, they only target ships that go to Israel, and they have informed all shipping that anyone that's not going to Israel, you just inform us and you'll pass safely. But the Americans insisting on maintaining Jewish supremacy in Israel and in safeguarding Israeli apartheid began, of course, along with their British subsidiaries, to attack Yemen and to make sure that no disruption to shipping to Israel would take place, opening effectively a new front that had not been opened before. So they do converge on the question of Palestine. The question of Palestine is important, which is why the majority of the world outside of the white supremacist West supports it and has always supported it, right? We've seen this, the accusations of Israel for committing genocidal policies began in the early 80s during its invasion of Lebanon and the massacres of Sabra and Shatila. We have seen over the last 17 years its ongoing bombing raids and sort of killing machines slaughtering thousands of Palestinians in Gaza have also resulted in it being called a genocidal country. In the 80s, the Soviet Union, even East Germany, several countries, Nicaragua and Cuba, had accused Israel of genocide. More recently, of course, we have the Brazilian president who's accused it of this. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela had accused Israel of this in 2014, as had Evo Morales. So you have a large number of third world leaders. Today, Namibia is absolutely appalled at Germany's ongoing support of Israeli genocide, especially, and it has, of course, a moral authority, having been being descendants of the genocide, the survivors of the genocide genocide that the Germans inflicted on them, as have the South Africans. You know, we do have a major amount of diplomatic solidarity from the Third World and military solidarity from resistance movements, whether the Houthis or Hezbollah. But the Americans are intent, of course, on suppressing any possible resistance to their diktat in the region, and their insistence on imposing Jewish supremacy on the rest of the Arab world in Israel. So the skirmishes, the diplomatic skirmishes with Netanyahu are only that. The goal is the same. The Americans have given the green light for Netanyahu to go into Gaza, even into Rafah. They quibble about minor things, in fact. The goal is the same.
Yes,
what has been absolutely extraordinary, I agree with the list of the opposition that has emerged on the global stage against Israel. But what you have not mentioned, and which has been extraordinary, has been the public response to the killing in Gaza. I mean, every country in the world has seen massive demonstrations demanding a ceasefire, demanding an end to the conflict. This has never happened before. It hasn't happened in living memory of anyone, and it certainly hasn't happened in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think this is, you know, one of the extraordinary elements which have completely overturned Israel's ability or America's ability to manipulate the situation. And when you have tens of thousands of people out in the streets of Europe and South Africa, South America, the United States, and other places.
I should add that, of course, also that a substantial number of anti-Israel and anti-Zionist Jewish groups have been part of these demonstrations, have led them, whether in the US, 2 days ago, members of Jewish Voice for Peace in New York have gone and demonstrated against the offices of the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, in New York, and protested senators who receive a lot of money from AIPAC. We have Jewish groups in Germany, in Britain, despite, of course, the anti-democratic policies of Germany that suppresses and bans pro-Palestinian demonstrations. There has been many Germans, including German Jews, who are opposed to Israel and to its genocide with signs of "not in our name." We see this even in France from a French anti-Zionist group, Jewish group, as well as Jewish intellectuals who've published open letters in Le Monde protesting the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians and opposing Israeli occupation. But of course, the weaponization of anti-Semitism is such that only Jews who support Israel are deserving of sympathy in the eyes of the white supremacist West, and Jews who are victims, Jews who are against Israel and support the Palestinians, are against the genocide, who become victims of the violence of the pro-Israel Jews, don't get any sympathy at all. Those Jews do not deserve sympathy, right? They have forfeited the right to sympathy of the white supremacist West.
So, Ahmed, I mean, as Joseph is saying, the people are out on the roads, streets, they're protesting, and yet you see the United Nations in a state of paralysis. So what do you think is the future of these multilateral institutions who seem completely paralyzed?
You know, unfortunately, I mean, we've seen this in issues related to Pakistan, over Afghanistan, over Kashmir, over other such issues. The UN only gets moving, really moving, when the big powers have given their okay and are supporting it. The big powers have not given their okay towards a UN role to negotiate a Palestinian Israeli conflict. And that has been so tragic, and that is the failure of the UN right now. And the failure of the UN is not in the UN itself, it is in the failure of the circumstances, and the failure of the P5, the big powers, who have not supported a UN-based negotiation. Now in Afghanistan, nobody wanted to negotiate with the communist regime. And the UN was given a role thinking that, oh, you know, the UN will do their usual diplomacy and then go back to sleep. And it was the UN that resolved produced the Geneva Accords, which led to the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and created the way forward for the Afghans. Now, the fact that it wasn't taken, that the Afghans dissolved into civil war, is nothing to do with the UN. But what is really needed is big power support for the UN. And we're seeing now, I mean, those doing the negotiations to try and end the war in Gaza are not the UN. It's Qatar, it's Egypt, it's the Israelis also, and the Americans. And of course, what we all need to see is a more determined shift in American policy. Every word that President Biden utters is analyzed to the finest point in the hope of trying to find any change in American policy. And so far, not much has changed. But I'm sure it will, because this conflict is not going to resolve itself through just UN mediation and other such things.
Thank you. Joseph, in the early days, we were always watching on television and seeing people in positions of power talk about the day after. What will the day after look like? It seems that question's just been, forgotten. But we'll be taking questions after this. As your last comment, what do you think the day after will look like for Palestine and for the region?
The so-called U.S. peace process, which is, of course, is the creation of the Machiavellian Henry Kissinger, was always about being a process and not about peace. And of course, the Palestinians really always wanted justice. I mean, you can have peace with a gun to someone's head, so you can't, the idea is about justice. So all U.S. mediation and all U.S. offers for a so-called solution insist on one point: the preservation of Jewish supremacy in Israel, that no solution can in any way threaten Jewish supremacy and apartheid in Israel. Israel must remain a Jewish supremacist state with a battery of racist laws against its population, must continue to have a racist flag that only identifies part of its population, a racist national anthem that only speaks of Jews and does not speak of over 22% of the population, among others. So that has to be preserved. And this, of course, is not only geostrategic on the part of the West, not even also ideological and only white supremacist, but also evangelical Christian. This idea that began through the Protestant Reformation, which of course began the idea of Zionism. This was a Protestant Christian idea for 300 years that Jews rejected. Only in the late 19th century was a bunch of Jewish intellectuals caught into this sort of idea of Zionism. But this idea from the late 18th century, when what we today call anti-Semites began to refer to Jews as not part of Europe, as if they're from outside of Europe. This strange, almost Hitlerian idea that European Jews actually are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, rather than they are, like European Christians, converts to this Palestinian religion. And that, in fact, the Palestinians themselves today are the descendants of the Canaanites and the Hebrews who had converted to Christianity and then to Islam. But you have the strange European population who claims the ancestors of the Palestinians as their own, in a way that you would never find, for example, anyone questioning that today's Egyptians are the descendants of the ancient Egyptians, or today's Iraqis are the descendants of the ancient Babylonians. Only the Palestinians somehow cannot be. And the idea, of course, the Zionist racist lie is that the Palestinians today are descendants of Arab settlers. Of course, as we know from historiography and from scholarship, the Arab conquest produced no more than 4,000 Arab settlers in Palestine. The Palestinian population is the descendant of the earlier populations of Palestine, something the Zionists themselves recognized. Ben-Gurion himself, the founder of Israel, wrote a book in 1919 saying how all the Palestinian peasants are in fact the descendants of the ancient Hebrews. But the evangelical Christian West, who has this amazing obsession obsession with its Protestant Christianity and this fanaticism wants to claim that somehow European Jews are descendants of the ancient Hebrews, and as if even if that were true, this would give them the right 2,000 years later to come and dislodge someone else. I mean, perhaps German Aryans can claim northern India and come back, since Aryans allegedly came from northern India. But so there is that kind of important element, Christian element to this ideology, not only a secular imperial one or just a white supremacist one. So it is a bit, there are several factors. So the US continues to insist, because of course, to insist on Israel's right to be a racist state. That is, so the code is it has to be a Jewish state, meaning a state that privileges Jews racially and religiously and ethnically against non-Jews. This cannot continue and will not continue. The Palestinians will never stop resisting this racist state. The only, of course, possible outcome that will bring about peace and prosperity for everyone is to give everyone equality, to give democracy. This is what Zionism and the US and the white world has been always against. They look at you with absolute horror if you actually propose that everyone should be treated equally, that Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, and Jews should be treated equally with no privileges to anyone. They look at you as, that you are the genocidal one rather than they are supporting the genocide of a colonial settler state. So unless there is some give, and of course the US now is in trouble on this count, as is Israel. Israel has proven to be a country militarily not as strong as everyone thought. Yes, of course, it is able to slaughter civilians. It can only triumph against civilians by slaughtering 100,000 of them between those it killed and injured, but it is unable to defeat a ramshackle guerrilla group that has been living in a concentration camp for 17 years. Remember, the Americans were able to actually defeat the Iraqi army in 5 weeks. We are 5 months later, and this Israeli army that seems to be a lot more feeble in its abilities against a military force has not been able to do anything except slaughter civilians. All of its strategic goals have not been achieved. None of them has been achieved. So as a result, it has lost also the trust of the US as a military power that can defend US imperial interests. It has made many of the Arab agents of US power who ruled the Arab world very, very nervous, because they had thought and depended on Israel defending their thrones should there be an uprising against them. So that part of the day after is not being spoken about. What will happen in Israel afterwards is not spoken about, because again, the Americans insist and they pivot all the time to make sure that nothing can touch the American and the Western world's commitment to Israel's right to remain a racist state.
Yeah. Ahmed, what do you think the day after will look like for the region?
Sorry?
What would you like to add to what you think the day after would look like for the region?
Well, first of all, I just hope that there will be a change of government in Israel, and a government that will produce some more benefits to the Israeli people and deal with the ongoing conflict and realize that this is it's a no-win situation. I mean, so I think that is the most important factor. Secondly is the U.S. policy. I mean, under President Biden, there was the hope that the U.S. policy would somehow dilute itself and be less adventurous. Biden pulled out of Afghanistan on the basis, pulled American troops out of Afghanistan on the basis that the U.S. did not want to fight any more land wars in the Middle East and in the region. And yet, we have seen Biden bombing Syria, bombing Iraq, attacking the Houthis in Yemen. Biden continues to pursue exactly the same policy that U.S. governments in the past have done. When are we going to see a shift a strategic shift in U.S. policy towards other regions of the world? Unfortunately, so far, we have not seen it. And certainly the Palestinians have suffered the most because we have not seen any kind of shift in American policy. As you said, I mean, American policy towards the Israelis and the Palestinians remains locked in this confrontation. America has the possibility of breaking the logjam, but it is not taking the necessary steps.
Well, if we can have the lights on in the hall, we've kind of run short. I thought we'd have about more time for questions. If you would just please keep your questions short, make them questions, not comments. And can you take the mic right there in front, please?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to comment Joseph of being a very brave man, and I hope you are not back in Senate hearings and lose your job like other people who have recently, the Harvard president lost her job. I hope your job is safe when you go back.
The Harvard president lost her job for not being pro-Israeli enough. She was quite anti-Palestinian and suppressed student groups.
So I hope I'm really grateful on
Do we have
comments.
the question now?
The question is basically, what do you think that this Sunni Muslim, they basically have disassociated themselves from this Palestinian cause? Do you think that in the day after and the times ahead, is it going to really hurt the Palestinian cause to that extent? And is it going to be a cause which is now being led for the last 10 years by the Shia Muslims? So how do you see that playing in the future? Thank you.
I think you're speaking more about regimes. At the popular level, of course, there's been massive demonstrations by Muslims who are Sunni as well as Shiite across the Muslim world against what is happening to the Palestinians. Now, the Arab regimes, you are correct, and other Muslim regimes who are beholden to the US have had a different take. But the Palestinians really, now have much bigger supporters. No one can outstage the moral authority of South Africa or even of Namibia in championing the Palestinian cause and in bringing about now some major legal repercussions for this racist Jewish state. So the Arab regimes are in trouble. They all want Hamas to be defeated, and they are making all kinds of deals to enrich themselves and remain in power by collaborating with Israel and the US, but they also know that if Israel has its own way, they will also be in a tough position. So whatever outcome this war will have, I think is one that is likely to weaken many of these Arab regimes who have pretended to be at the level of rhetoric supportive of the Palestinians while in fact helping and aiding the Israelis.
So the next question, Selina.
Hello. I have a question for you, Mr. Massad. My question is...
I can't see you.
I'm right here.
Thank you.
Picking up from the gentleman's comment, I wanted to ask you your experience on whether the academic space has sort of shrunk in the United States over the occupation in Palestine. Is there space for points of view like yours? And is there room for open discussion and debate, or do the rules of free speech not apply to you?
They don't. We are, of course, we've been reminded. I should mention that the president of Columbia University is a Muslim Egyptian woman whose support for Israel in this war is unmatched by anyone else. And she, like the previous president of Columbia University, have reminded us that, of course, private universities in the US do not have the obligation to offer free speech. Only public universities do. What they do offer is, of course, academic freedom, which they cannot take away. But at the same time, of course, there's been a lot of pressure. People who speak from both sides of their mouths while saying, oh, Israel does some bad things, but so do the Palestinians, but Israel is good, and so are the Palestinians. Those are invited to do teach-ins at Columbia University. I've been asked, of course, to do teach-ins by the students, but the students themselves have found themselves in a terrible, terrible situation. Some of our students were attacked by chemical weapons by students who were formerly in the Israeli army, and the university has done very little to help them. At least 12 of them have been hospitalized with ongoing health problems as a result of these chemical sprays. But we do have a lot of faculty that are, of course, critical of the university. In fact, students and faculty across campuses in the US have been quite active. It is the administrations who are conservative, mostly on account of issues of funding and money. But there's also, I think, an issue, I mean, aside from the right-wing attack on intellectual life in the US, I also believe there's an anti-Semitic attitude by university administrations who believe that donors, if they happen to be Jewish, would be offended if you if you criticize Israel. This assumption that all Jews support Israel is a very anti-Semitic assumption by those who run universities. However, they hold on to it as if it's actually pro-Jewish and not anti-Semitic, as if Jews cannot have a variety of political views and positions about Israel. In some ways, I think activism continues. The suppression of views that are supportive of the Palestinians is not new to American campuses. This is what the Americans had done during McCarthyism and in the 60s against views that supported, that were seen as supportive of communism or of the Soviet Union. Censorship has always been part of American academic life. People have fought to maintain our academic freedom. We continue to fight. Who knows what's going to happen with this ongoing bowing down to right-wing forces and the kind of cowardice that the higher administration of universities, especially Ivy League universities, have demonstrated over the last 5 months.
Let me just say that, student activism in the United States was a potent factor in ending the American war in Vietnam. If you remember the student activism, nobody had ever seen anything like it before that in the United States. It played a major role. And I'm sure what you're seeing now is a general dislike of US policy in the Middle East. And the kind of demonstrations that you've had are not based on one sex or one color or, the people of all races have come into the streets to protest. And so in a way, the protests we're seeing right now are in fact probably bigger than what we saw during the Vietnam War. And I think it's a signal for the US to understand that their own population is now becoming radicalized because of this ongoing conflict.
I should say that also this is despite the ongoing official propaganda in the mainstream American media and the US government, and even university administrations who just ape Israeli propaganda. I mean, the appalling anti-Semitic claim by the Israeli government that the prison break of October 7th was the largest attack on Jews since the Holocaust wants to say that Israeli Jews are being attacked for being Jews. Israeli Jews were attacked for being colonists, not for being Jews. Jews in Europe were killed for being Jews. To implicate European Jews who were killed solely for being Jewish with Israeli Jews who are being attacked for being colonists is an anti-Semitic attack on Jews. It implicates Jews who have refused Zionism, who rejected it, and who died in the Holocaust because they refused to heed the Zionist call to become colonists in Palestine. It's appalling, but these lines, you can't get any critical commentary on them because they just ape the official Israeli propaganda line.
Thank you, Professor Joseph Massad. Thank you, Ahmed Rashid. We are arranging a signing by Professor Joseph Massad in the signing hall, which has been set aside at near Hall 4, and this would be in about half an hour. So if you'd like to bring your books to be signed over there. Thank you.